When BJ sent me the title of this lesson, without reading the passage, I thought, I can go a lot of places with this one. I thought about considering the ways of the Proverbs 31 woman, the ultimate wise woman in Scripture, right? I thought about the ways of the women who ministered to Jesus as he traveled from place to place. I even thought about considering the ways of women like Irene Taylor and Jane McWhorter, women who have stood in this place and shared their wisdom, who are now dead, yet speak. But then, as a speaker ought to do, I looked at the passage of Scripture. I opened it up and I read it, and my initial reaction was, thanks, BJ. Because here's what I know that you don't. I hate bugs. I mean, really, I hate bugs. Both my husbands, my son, all my grandsons, they've had to learn that I don't like bugs. The little Caleb and Jonathan used to come in with bugs in their pockets to show me, and what was really cool is my best friend, their other grandmother, she does bugs, so I could send them to her. I don't do bugs. But then I read this passage and realized we had to talk about bugs today. So I sighed heavily, and then I girded up my loins, and I set myself to the work of preparing this lesson. And I chose those words very carefully because work and preparation are what this lesson is all about today. So I started thinking about work. In America today, the idea of work, it occurred to me that for a lot of people in our society, work is a 4-letter word. And so I did what all good-blooded Americans do. I went to Google and I looked up the phrase, work is a 4-letter word. Did you know that that phrase was the title of a song in 1967? I was only 4 years old, a song. In 1968, there was a British comedy film with that title. And just last year, in 2022, there was an article by that title on the website ft.com. I doubt any of you knew that. Is anybody here who knew those 3 things? Yeah, I didn't either until I was doing this lesson. But I bet you do know the attitude of work, toward work, that exists in America today, don't you? Tom went to, he mentioned his lesson yesterday, went to a home improvement store for a 4x8 piece of plywood that he had ordered online. And the lady, young girl who was behind the counter, took the order form that he had printed out and brought with him with the order number on it. Remember, a 4-foot by 8-foot piece of plywood. She's looking in the 12 by 12 cubicles behind her to find this piece of plywood. He said, ma'am, it won't be there because it's a 4 by 8, but we have to look here first. We don't know how to work in America anymore. The other time he went there, it took 45 minutes for them to find his order because they're all gathered around. Let me see if you can guess. It was Saturday afternoon in Alabama. Do you know what they were gathered around? Yeah, while they're supposed to be working. 2020 brought us COVID, and that was the beginning of what we call the Great Resignation, when so many of us decided, hey, we don't have to go to work, so we just won't go to work anymore. Well, that gave way to the idea of what has been termed quiet quitting. You know, I go to work, my body shows up in that place or in that role, or now in front of a screen where the boss has software watching me, but I'm not actually doing my job. I show up, I get my paycheck, but I may not be doing anything while I'm there. 2 recent surveys I want you to know about. One of them was done in England, the other was done in America. And I know that this is what the researchers would call a small sample size. One of them was only 2,000 kids. But these are kids. These are our kids in the generation that we have today. One of the surveys said that social media influencer is the 4th most wanted career. 4th. The other survey said an astounding 86% of our kids want to grow up to be a social media influencer. Do you know why? Because it's not a job that you have to go to work for. All you got to do is set up your phone and do something. Just talk for a few minutes, upload it, and you're done for the day, and you can have people pay you to do it. That's what our young folks today want to do. Our affluent America has ruined our work ethic because we feel like we've got it made. And if America's got it made, I shouldn't have to get it made for myself. Please open the scriptures with me. Proverbs chapter 6 is our text for the day, the passage that I read, and this is where we meet the bugs. Proverbs chapter 6, beginning in verse 6, "Go to the ant, thou sluggard, consider her ways, and be wise, which having no guide, overseer, or ruler, provideth her meat in the summer, and gathereth her food in the harvest. How long wilt thou sleep, O sluggard? When wilt thou arise out of thy sleep? Yet a little sleep, a little slumber, a little folding of the hands to sleep. So shall thy poverty come as one that travelleth, and thy want as an armed man." We are an affluent nation with a terrible work ethic, but we're not the first nation to have that problem, are we? We know that Solomon's Israel had the same problem. They were as affluent. In fact, they're likely more affluent than we are. They had the same problem, though, and Solomon, the wisest man ever on the earth besides the Christ, did not refer to his own wisdom in this matter. He did not bring in the priest who had a direct connection with God to bring the people the word. He didn't turn to their equivalent of our business consultants or researchers. Instead, he focused this problem, the attention toward this problem, on this little tiny creature. He said, "You folks who have this I don't want to work attitude, pay attention to the bug. Go to the ant, thou sluggard." And so in our lesson today, we're going to cover 4 main points. We're going to talk about the sluggard and how God views the sluggard. Number 2, we're going to talk about the ant and her work ethic. Number 3, other life principles we can learn from the ant. And then 4, we'll discuss ways to avoid producing another generation of sluggards. I hope it's not too late. Number 1, the sluggards. How many of you have used the word sluggard in conversation in the last 48 hours? Have you even heard anybody else use the word in the last 2 months? It's not a word we use in today's America. We not only don't like to think about it, but we don't talk about we don't use this word. But it's the word that's used in the 5 main versions of the scriptures that you'll find in the Brotherhood today. In the King James, New King James, ESV, ASV, and NIV, you will find the word sluggard. And so I think it behooves us to pause just a moment and figure out what this definition of this word is. Dictionary.com defines sluggard as a person who is habitually inactive or lazy. Now I want to put a pause right here. Paul would have said, let's put down a peg. There are those among us who have illnesses. Whether we can see the illness or not, they deal with those illnesses on a regular basis. There are times where those of us who have those issues just have to go to bed because it's the only thing we can do. It's the only option we have. I'm not talking about y'all, and Solomon was not talking about y'all either. Y'all's one of those southern words. It means you, all of us, okay? I'm not talking about those of us who have to get more rest than we want to have to get. I'm talking about those of us who have made a habit out of doing nothing. Those of us who simply aren't willing to get up and go, to get up and be a productive member of society. Back in the days of World War I, those people who wouldn't do what they were supposed to do, they were called malingerers. Now we've come a little farther ahead in time. We call them couch potatoes. You guys know who these people are from literature. Remember Tom Sawyer? He's famous because he talked everybody else into whitewashing that fence while he just watched. You remember Rip Van Winkle. What's he famous for? Sleeping 20 years. And then Paul Meacham's favorite, Garfield the cat. The quintessential 1980s mascot for laziness. God defined a sluggard, though. And I think this is where we get our best picture because it came from the best source. So please open up the book of Proverbs with me. We're going to go to several passages and try to see what God, how he views the sluggard. And also, he didn't just describe, but he tells us what's going to happen at the end of the sluggard's life. I started to say the sluggard's work, but that's antithetical, isn't it? The sluggard doesn't work. All right, so let's begin in our text here. Proverbs chapter 6, verse 10. Well, verse 9, how long are you going to sleep, sluggard? How long are you going to stay asleep? When are you going to get up? Verse 10, you're going to sleep a while. When you wake up from your sleep, then you're going to decide a little slumber is a good idea. And after the slumber, why, it's time for another nap. One thing after another, but it's all sleep. And what's the end? Verse 11, so shall thy poverty come. You see, if you don't work, if you choose to be habitually inactive and lazy, you're going to be in poverty. And I love the end of that verse, thy want as an armed man. If someone mugs you, you don't have an option, do you? He's standing there with a gun, and you pretty much need to do what he tells you to do or you're done for, right? That's the end of the lazy man. Just as surely as that armed man is coming and you can't avoid it, if you're lazy, you're not going to be able to avoid poverty. You're not going to have the things you think you deserve to have because you didn't put out any effort to get them. All right, what's God's next thing? This one was really hard for me. Chapter 10 and verse 26. As vinegar to the teeth and as smoke to the eyes, so is the sluggard to them that send him. Get your pronouns right, April. Vinegar to the teeth. Can y'all imagine sticking your finger in vinegar and then rubbing it on your teeth? It's worse than the nails scratching on the chalkboard used to be. And then smoke in the eyes. People in the fall time, they like bonfires, but I always have to make sure I'm on the upwind side because the smoke just burns and it burns and it burns. Have you ever worked with somebody like that? Somebody whose work was so bad, you had to cover for them. They made you cringe. We've got a term, cringe-worthy, in today's society. They're cringe-worthy people to have on your team because you know not only are they not going to move the work forward, but they're going to make it harder for you to move it forward. Cringe-worthy people. Smoke to the eyes, vinegars to the teeth. Let's go to chapter 20 and verse 4. Proverbs 20 and verse 4. What does God think? How does God describe a sluggard? The sluggard will not plow by reason of the cold. Therefore shall he beg and harvest and have nothing. Baby, it's cold outside. I can't go out there and work. It's too cold. It's uncomfortable. I might sweat and then it'd freeze on me. This is a bad thing. But he's not done. Go to chapter 22 and verse 13. And by the way, this is repeated in 26:13. 22:13, the slothful man saith, there is a lion without. I shall be slain in the streets. I got to stay inside because if I go out and try to get anything done, the lions might get me. And I understand that in the wilderness of Judea, in the valley there where the Jordan River was, there were lions there. David slew a lion with his hand. There's lions in the land, okay? But not downtown, right? You think where there's a village of people, that's not typically where the lions would go. Probably not the best excuse. But you see, they're too lazy to even come up with the good excuses. But they're going to be busy making the excuses. Let's go now to 26:16. Sluggards. Verse 16, the sluggard is wiser in his own conceit than 7 men that can render a reason. You put together a committee of wise men, they're going to have wise counsel. The sluggards, though, they know more than those 7 men. The original know-it-all, that's a sluggard. And that's what made me think of the social media influencers. Because these young folks, they think they have found these neatest little hacks. It was just last year, we were sitting at lunch at a lectureship, and an older lady looked at Tim and said, What's a hack? What are all these things these kids are doing? I said, it's the little things that we all know how to do. It is. You use 25 uses for aluminum foil. Does it really take somebody on social media to tell us that? Or maybe we could just call our mom and figure this. Yeah. The original know-it-all. Sluggards have a bad reputation. Look in chapter 24 and verse 30. 24:30, I went by the field of the slothful and by the vineyard of the man void of understanding, and lo, it was all grown over with thorns, and nettles had covered the face thereof, and the stone wall thereof was broken down. It is doubtful that anyone would walk by the field and the vineyard of the slothful man and look for an example of how to be. This guy has a bad reputation. You don't want to be like him. Sluggards, chapter 13 and verse 4, focus on wishful thinking. Now that can't get them anywhere, but they're dreamers. They're always thinking they're going to get this and have this, but they're never willing to put forth the activity to do it. And I love this one. Look in chapter 26 and verse 14. This is my favorite word picture for a sluggard. 26:14 was the verse 13 was the excuse of the lion. It identifies the slothful man. As the door turneth upon his hinges, so does the slothful upon his bed. Have you ever watched a door swinging without anybody dealing with it? I mean, it just moves back and forth, right? Slothful man is like that, just turning over and over and over in his bed. How far does the door get? It doesn't do any more than that, and neither does the slothful man. Isn't that a great word picture? But then we've got what one of the commentators called a sarcastic hyperbole. The ultimate picture of the slothful. Look in chapter 26 and verse 15. The slothful hideth his hand in his bosom. It grieveth him to bring it to his mouth again. The bowl of food is sitting right in front of him, but he can't even put forth the effort to stretch his arm out and put the food in his mouth. He needs somebody to put it in his mouth for him. Folks, this is not what we need to be. You got to wonder about this sluggard if he even needs help chewing. Are you going to have to put it in his mouth and then move the jaw up and down? So, God says, this sluggard, this is not what you're supposed to be. And so he gives Solomon the inspiration to write this passage in Proverbs chapter 6, verses 6 through 11. He says, sluggard, consider the ant and be wise. The implication here is that we're to be not only aware of the kind of work that the ant does, but we're supposed to be just like that. So let's talk about the ant. I don't like them when they're in my kitchen. But as I thought about this lesson, as we all have to, when we don't know why God put it in there, we just have to accept in faith that that was the best illustration that was possible because God put it there. But I'm speaking on it, so I needed to figure out why. So I came up with 4 possibilities as to why Solomon, through inspiration, said, go look at the ant. Go watch the ant and see what she's doing. And I say she. Let me make this point right here. I say she because the worker ants are all female. The role of the male in an ant colony is simply to mate with the queen, and typically then they die. So yes, the women, we got to keep things going. All right, what makes the ants such a good object lesson? Number 1, they're easy to find. Ants are the most numerous insect group in the whole world, and they're on every continent except Antarctica, so they're easy to find. Okay, number 2, they're easy to watch because even a lazy man can lay down in the grass and watch them. They're everywhere, and they're easy to watch. Number 3, ants don't threaten the sluggard with their yelling. I found a quote from Ben Franklin. He said, none preaches better than the ant, and she says nothing. Ants don't threaten the sluggard's peace with yelling. And number 4, ants are impressive. Even bug haters like me are impressed. Here's your Brother Taylor shout out, with their incessant industry and their productive productivity, or the persistent productivity. We don't even know what they're doing. And yet we can't fail to be impressed by the fact that they're all in while they're doing it. 4 reasons that God may have given us the ant to look at. There's all these things that we can watch them do, but there's 2 lessons in this passage that we're supposed to learn. First, the ants have no guide, overseer, or ruler. That's in chapter 6 and verse 7. No guide, no overseer, no ruler. They don't have a boss. Nobody's standing over them, making them do what they do, and yet they're doing it. Nobody has to make them do it. They do their work because they were made to do that work. And my question to you is, do you realize you were made to work? Open, please, with me to Genesis chapter 2. This was a very powerful point as I was studying this lesson. Genesis chapter 2. Verse 15, and the Lord God took the man and put him into the Garden of Eden. Why? He tells us to dress it and to keep it. Now in chapter 2, we get other lessons here, other things that God gave man. We always look down in verse 18, the beginning of the record where God created woman. That's important. That's a need that man had that God met, okay? The relationship. And it gives him the rules about eating. You've got this food provided, just avoid this tree and everything else is fair game. But before he did any of that, the first need he met is giving man something to do. He gave him physical labor. Now, I know someone might argue that physical labor, that came as punishment in chapter 3 for the sin. No, that's not right. The work is here in chapter 2. It was the difficulty of the work. That's what came as punishment in chapter 3. He gave us, he made us to work. And the ant teaches us that. Nobody has to tell us to do it. We do it, just like the ant, because we're made to work. All right, the second concept in Proverbs chapter 6 for the sluggard is to consider the ant's providence. And by the word providence, I'm not talking about God's non-miraculous care. Okay, the word providence is defined as the timely preparation for future eventualities. Get ready today for tomorrow. That's the idea. There's over 12,000 different varieties of ants, and they're all different colors. They grow different size colonies or build colonies. They eat different foods. They live in different weather. But consistent across all these 12,000 things is the fact that they focus intently on doing what their nest needs to survive before the need exists. Look at Proverbs chapter 30 and verse 25 with me. Proverbs chapter 30 and verse 25. I read this and I read this and I read this, and then I caught something else today. Proverbs 30 verse 25, because I didn't start in verse 24. At verse 25, the ants are a people not strong, yet they prepare their meat in the summer. They get ready ahead of time for when they need something. But look at verse 24. There be 4 things which are little upon the earth. They are exceeding wise. It's not just wise. She's exceeding wise to get things ready before she needs it. In chapter 10 and verse 5, Solomon calls the man who gathers in summer a wise man. And we all know in Proverbs 31 that part of the praise this woman, this proverbial woman, gets is that she prepares clothing before her family needs them. Now, I know in 2023 America, this lesson may not seem so important because it's a fact. We've got Amazon Prime. Those poor folks back in Israel, they didn't have that. And if we order it today, we ought to be able to get it tomorrow, unless we live in a city that's got same-day delivery, right? Yeah. We can go pop down to the deli and pick up an already prepared meal. We can just take it home and eat it. And frankly, ladies, our conveniences have made us lazy. They've made us lazy anymore, haven't they? I used to do some babysitting, and I had a grandmother of a family tell me that her grandkids used to like for her to come visit because Mama just gave them cereal bars and macaroni and cheese and peanut butter sandwiches. That's what they had to eat until grandmother came, and then grandmother would fix other things for them. And mamas, learn from the ants here. Learn from the ants. It is your job to be sure that your family has good, healthy food to eat. It's yours. It's your job to be sure that your children have clothes when they need. Have y'all seen my son? It seemed like every other week I was having to buy new clothes and new shoes for the kid. So I'm not saying that you're sinning if he grew overnight. I'm saying you're not doing your job if you're not staying up with the fact that he's growing overnight. Okay? Have the clothes ready, have the foods ready. Solomon said, go to the ant, watch her and learn from her. Here's my question to you. If the ant is watching you in your home, does she find a kindred spirit? Are you getting ready? Now, some of us are past the days of rearing children in our homes. We're later in our lives. Some of us need to be sure that we are preparing, young or old, for the possible eventuality of losing our mates. Are you ready for that? I wasn't. Fortunately, the Lord blessed us with 16 months to get ready for losing Paul. And we had time to put some things in order. And that was a real blessing because we hadn't put things in order before that. Have you? You see, the idea of being prepared means that while you have a husband, you prepare for the possible eventuality when you won't. Do you know how to pay the bills? Do you know what tools to use for what jobs? If you don't know how to do something, do you know who to go to find out for help? Those are hard questions. Those are hard questions to ask. You need to be asking them before you need them, before you need those things. A farmer advertised for men to work on his farm, but he only got one applicant, an 18-year-old. The farmer kept saying, "Can you do this and can you do this?" And the young man said, "No, I don't know how to do that. I don't know how to do that." And the farmer said, "Well, what can you do?" He said, "I can sleep when the wind blows." Well, the farmer didn't have a clue what that meant, but he hired the young man anyway because he was the only one who volunteered or offered to come work for him. A few days later, a storm hit. One of those big storms, lots of thunder, lots of lightning, rain, and major wind. It woke up the farmer, and he ran to the barn where the young man was asleep. The young man's sleeping. He said, "I can sleep in a storm," and he proved his words true. Instead of trying to wake the young man up, the farmer starts looking around. He said, "I've got to take care of the animals," and he went, and the animals are all secure where they're supposed to be, being taken care of and protected. The barn doors were bolted shut. The hay outside was covered and tied down so it wasn't going to blow away. And as the farmer went back to his house, he understood. The young man could sleep in the storm because he had properly prepared. A lot of storms in life come at us. Have we used the self-motivation that we should have? Have we prepared ourselves ahead of time for when those storms come into our lives? And this passage is addressed to sluggards, but there are some lessons that we can learn from the ants that are not necessarily for sluggards. They're for those of us who know how to be productive, but they are wise life lessons, and I wanted to talk about a few of those for just a moment. Number one that we can learn, even if we're not a sluggard, is ants communicate clearly. You've seen one. They walk this way and another one walks this way, and then they touch their antenna. That's how they communicate. This one's saying, "You need to go over there because that's where they've left the bread out, that it's got the good garlic butter on it, and go get those crumbs," okay? If that doesn't seem like that big a deal to you, remember Babel? Everything was going great in that situation until God confused their language. Satan's confusing our language today, folks. In the church today, Satan's confusing our language. We've got to go back to 1 Corinthians chapter 1 and verse 7. Think the same things, judge the same way, and speak the same things. And when we communicate clearly with one another, we're going to speak the truth, Ephesians 4:25. We're going to build one another up, Ephesians 4:29. And we're going to have language that's always with grace, seasoned with salt, Colossians 4:6. Think about how often the work of the church is killed, not by inactivity, but with words. So lesson number one from the ants, they communicate clearly. Number two, ants are social insects, which means they practice a division of labor. The worker ants do not try to become the queen. They have their job. The queen does the work of reproduction. The worker ants protect the nest, gather the food. If something attacks a nest, part of the worker ants surround the queen and protect her. The others make sure that all of the ant eggs go further into the nest, protected in a special place that they put them in, and then they stand guard. The ants protect themselves, protect the future. In the home, ladies, your job's not to be the leader. Don't try to be. Be like the ants and remember the division of labor. The leadership role belongs to the husband. In the church, the men have the role of leadership. Have y'all watched, when you've been here for the lectures, have you watched the Forest Hill Women? There's an ant colony in real life to watch. Those women work together fantastically, always making sure things are taken care of here. That's why things work so well for the lectureship here, because they remember their role. They let the men lead, and they follow. A lot of times I hear young women expending a lot of energy whining about, I don't get to do so-and-so in the church. Or if they would just put that energy into doing what God sent them to do, they would be so much happier. Lesson number 3, ants don't settle for good enough. There's a super colony in California that stretches for 560 miles. That blew me away. And then I read the next sentence. That's only 1/6 the size of the super colony in Europe of the same kind of ant. This is what I would call success. But they don't stop. They keep going and they keep growing. And that's a lesson for us in the church. When we work, we need to do the best we can every day. Ecclesiastes 9 and verse 10, whatsoever thy hand findeth to do, do it with thy might. In Colossians 3:23, remember that whatever you do it as for the Lord, because our goal is to glorify Him. You remember 2 Peter 3:18, Peter closes out with, grow in grace and knowledge of our Lord and Savior Jesus Christ. And remember Jesus, Luke 2:52, He increased in wisdom, stature, and in favor with God and man. Good enough isn't good enough. God's looking for the best, just like the ants. Remember next, the ants cooperate. A scientist found that 10 or more fire ants can stick together to build a life-saving raft. I watched a little video of this. One climbs over the next and holds on, and then another one climbs over that. They produce this little ramp, a raft. We have an overwhelming flood of immorality and worldliness that's attacking the church. Are we providing a life-saving raft for our children? Or are we throwing them out there into the world? Do we have our heads buried in the sand, pretending that this problem doesn't even exist? Or are we cooperating together to protect our young? The ants cooperate. The secret, the individual goals of the ant, listen, are less important than the overall goals of the colony. Our goals have got to be getting one another to heaven. We glorify God in so doing. And when we submit our desires to the good of the group, that's the idea behind the unity in Ephesians chapter 4, 1 through 4. Ants defend the nest against attack. Are we defending? Are we standing with the other women of God, the other men of God who are defending the faith? And stay focused on the goal. We're busy people. And a lot of times the busyness that we are is out in the world with secular jobs and secular activities and secular school. But folks, Satan today is using church programs to distract us too. Let me ask you a question. Are the programs in your congregation bringing glory to God? Because you see, if they're not, they're just busy work. The ant isn't about busy work. She is persistently productive with her goal. And our goal is to glorify God, and we better be persistently productive in so doing. Ants ask for help. When Paul was sick, I didn't have to ask much. One lady called me one Sunday afternoon. She said, I'd like to bring your supper tonight. I said, thank you, but I don't need food. But I need sheets. They brought a hospital bed for Paul that afternoon, and I didn't have sheets that would fit that bed. She said, I'll bring them. And she did. We help one another. Ants do that. I saw another video where the ants were helping each other carry this big stick. It looked like it was about 6 inches long, and the ants were carrying it because they were working together. There's other lessons for the ants that are listed in the book, and I hope you go read them. Life lessons that those of us who are not sluggards need to follow. But I want to spend the last few minutes of our session together today in our last section. We need to avoid developing another generation of sluggards. Proverbs chapter 20 and verse 11. Even a child is known by his doings, whether his work be pure and whether it be right. And the sad truth is, mamas, pay attention. If you have a lazy child, it's your fault. That's painful, isn't it? If a child works hard with whatever ability he has, at whatever age he is, he's a hard worker. But if he doesn't work hard with whatever ability he has, or whatever age he is, he's lazy. And you've got to be sure that you're doing your part to not turn that pure infant that God gave you into a lazy child. So what can you do? Number one, go to the Bible. Make Bible story times, and you need to have those every day. Make your Bible stories about work regularly. Genesis 1:1, in the beginning, God created. You ever tried to create anything? Would you call that work? God was a worker. When Nehemiah went to Jerusalem, he had the big job of rebuilding those walls, and they finally did so in 52 days because the people had a mind to work. You want your children to be good workers? Help them work on their minds. You can do this. You can. I believe in you. Encourage them to be workers like the little servant maid in 2 Kings 5. She was a servant. So are we to be. The parable of the talents, Matthew 25:26. God, through inspiration, that householder said, "You worker, you are wicked because you're slothful." He describes those in both terms. If you're lazy, you're wicked in God's eyes. Teach your kids that it is more blessed to give than to receive, because you're supposed to work not only to meet your own needs, but to help support the weak. That's why Paul taught in the book of Acts that he worked with his own hands so that he could teach the Christians. It's their job to help support the weak. How do we avoid teaching our children to be lazy? You start teaching them when they're barely toddlers. If you've got young ones at home, if they're sitting up, great, that's work at that moment in life. But by the time they're crawling, they can move something from one side to the other and put it away. Start working with them from the very moment they're able to hold on to that. Little ones can fold washcloths. They don't have to be perfect squares. They can do that, and they want to, so use that as a foundation. And mamas, if you've got kids who are a little older and they're not working the way you should, step one is to sit them down and apologize to them. Admit that you did this part wrong and tell them we're going to do this better from now on, and teach them to work. Now, I said teach. That's not really the best word, because teaching usually means I'm going to tell you, and if you don't do it the way I want, I'm going to yell at you. No. Ryan Sullins brought 3 young men to Tom's house last June, and he trained them how to load a truck. He trained them. I loved watching these young men train these boys how to be servants, and they loaded our truck for us. Tom didn't, he was gone. Tia and I loaded, helped, and these young men did this job. Here's a quote that I want you to get. There's all the difference in the world between telling a child and training a child. Don't tell and yell. Put their hands where they need to be. Show them how it's supposed to happen. That means you're going to have to be there with them. And that means you're not going to be able to do the work that you needed to do for that moment, because at that moment your work is showing them how to do what they need to do. Mamas, please don't use your children as your slaves. Be with them working, but don't be there sitting and sending them to do things. It is not sinful to say, would you please go get that for me? But what I'm saying, it is sinful to be habitually inactive and sending them to do it for you. Now, that will lead to a rebellious spirit. It's exactly the opposite of what you want. On the other hand, don't always go help them do it. Because if you want to have an independent worker, you need to let them work and sometimes fail independently. And that's hard, because we want things to be easier for them than they were for us. But you really don't. Because if they're easier for them than they were for us, then they don't learn the work ethic. Praise them appropriately. The idea of extrinsic acknowledgement means, I'm so proud of you. They learn to do something so they get something from outside. That's not the best choice. Teach them to want intrinsic satisfaction. Teach them to ask, aren't you proud of yourself for doing such a good job? Wasn't that great for you to do for somebody else? Teach them that it needs to be inside, not outside. And that means you use the concept of allowance appropriately. Let me encourage you to use the idea of allowance as money management training, not as work training. Yes, the workman is worthy of his hire. I know that. You do too. But children aren't workmen. And if you pay a child to do every little thing he does, then he's going to expect to be paid for every little thing he does. Again, there's other points. But as a teacher, I tend to give homework for my classes. Here's your homework, mamas. I challenge you. Print out Proverbs chapter 6, verses 6 through 8. Put it on your wall. Talk to your kids about what this passage means. And then have your children challenge them to work around the house without being formally expected to do it. Yes, there are things you need to formally expect them to do, but challenge them to find things that you haven't told them to do and have them do it. Then they can write it on a note or take a picture of the completed job, and you can spread those all over the wall. Now here's your assessment part. Okay, this is what I got from my education classes. We do the work and then we assess it. Here's what I want. By PTP of this year, I would love for you to do this. Then take a picture of your wall and bring it to me at PTP so I can rejoice with you. These principles work because the wise God sent it through the wise Solomon, and if we're wise, we will do these things. God bless you as you become an ant in your home.